It's a great pleasure to be here with Jill. Jill and I met a number of years ago. We've had a couple of conversations. In fact, Jill even came to the Enquirer and Mirror to meet with our reporters. We'd have these brown bag lunches. We've had David Halberstam, Tim Russert, Maureen Orth, and Jill Abramson. So it's great to welcome you here, Jill.
Thank you, Marianne. I wanted to stay. Why didn't I stay?
I have to say, this book, when I saw it come out, I make a real habit of supporting our local bookstores. But when I read that this was coming out and they didn't have it yet, I actually did order it from Amazon so I could get it right away. But this is an amazing book, really chronicling a decade of disruption in community journalism and newspapers because of the internet. And Jill has done an amazing job of researching this and really looking through the lens of 4 companies and adding one more through BuzzFeed that our own, John Johnson has been a big investor of, Vice, that I'm sorry to say I hadn't heard of. And then the New York Times, where Jill was for much of her career, and the Washington Post, with a little chapter on Facebook as well. So, Jill's no stranger to Nantucket. In fact, she got her first start in journalism here in a way. And how was that?
It was great. It was my launching pad. And for the particular reporting assignment that was my very first, I didn't have to move off of the porch of the little house that my parents were renting here. It was the summer that Joe Kennedy had that terrible Jeep accident in which, a girl riding with him had been badly hurt. And just like on Thursday, there were no ferries going, obviously no planes flying. And so the news media couldn't get their people onto Nantucket. And just through a friend who worked as the manager of the Boston Bureau of Time magazine, she knew that the Abramsons were in Nantucket for the summer. And she tracked me down and said, if you can find anything out, you will be golden. And, as it happened, my parents had become good friends with a doctor on the island, and he was, of course, the soul of discretion, but his wife was very chatty. And so the weather not being great that day, the men, my father and the doctor, went off to scrub the boat or do something Nantucket manly. But my mother and the wife of this doctor were just chatting and knocking back some cocktails. And all I did is listen. I heard the whole horrible story of this, really quite tragic event. And then the second this woman was gone, I called my contact in the Bureau to explain, who this person was and how I knew this information. But that was my big scoop, was not moving from a chair on the porch of our little house on Swains Wharf. So I was rewarded when I got back to school in the fall with a stringer's job. To do part-time reporting on newsworthy subjects going on at Harvard.
And you told me you're not on the Crimson. You were on a different paper.
I was on the much less rigorous Harvard Independent, which was a weekly.
A weekly paper. Weeklies are good. You can go in depth. And then your career from there, we'll have you reading a little bit, but...
Well, I wanted to talk more about my career here.
Oh, please do. You and I share another job. We both worked at a rather infamous place. Not together.
So I was living with my parents that fateful summer that I became a reporter, kind of, and I had 2 jobs. By day, I worked, some of you may remember, there's a Hickory Farms cheese shop here, so that was my day job, and my night job that I hitchhiked to was as a cocktail waitress at Preston's Airport Lounge. One of the great dive bars of America, which sadly burned down. And that job was instrumental to a different part of my education, because the Jill rule at Preston's was that if anybody ordered a drink I hadn't heard of, I took a sip of it before I served it. So, no. I mean, I have tried very hard, every year to get back here. I've visited in the winter, and, I have had the privilege of speaking both at the Unitarian Church as part of a speakers series and also at the Athenaeum. And, I was just thinking, Marianne, on my way over here, that the talk that I gave at the Unitarian Church was about the threats to freedom of the press back during the Bush years after 9/11, when various, the clamping down of civil liberties was going on. But in many ways, and I was very worried about it and trying to, connect with the audience about how worried they should be about that. But it's kind of child play.
It's a little different now.
What's going on now?
Yeah, they weren't talking about fake news back then,
right? No, we were not.
They were not. So your path up through, you were in the news business, what, about 40 years?
Yes.
Yeah, about that. So from Harvard, looks like you worked for Time and a couple of magazines, but then you were at the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
At the Wall Street Journal. And did you work with Dan Pearl?
I did. Not all of you may remember who Danny Pearl was. He is a great young journalist at the Wall Street Journal, and he and I did quite a few stories together in Washington, where we both worked for the Journal. And then Danny became a foreign correspondent, and he was in London, and then after 9/11, he was moved to Pakistan because he was going to be covering all the trouble in Afghanistan. And he was kidnapped in January of 2002 and killed by an Al-Qaeda.
Journalism has always, for foreign correspondents, in areas of war and areas of turmoil, has always held an element of danger. But now we're seeing it sort of coming back home as well. There have been more threats to journalists.
There definitely. And, Katie Tur of NBC News, who covered the 2016 election, was often traveling with Donald Trump when he was a candidate. NBC had to get private security for her because the crowds, Donald Trump likes to point out when he has rallies exactly where the press is. And, for some reason, she was the focus of a lot of the anger that was directed at the press, and she felt, in physical danger. She's pretty intrepid. I know her. So it's become globally an ever more dangerous profession. I think 2017 had a record number of journalist deaths because, countries like Turkey, where you used to be able to report safely, are now, there are more journalists in jail in Turkey, I think, than anywhere else.
Well, let's talk. Speaking of Turkey, let's talk about the Washington Post columnist. Did you know him? The Washington Post columnist who was...
I did not know him, but know another Washington Post journalist who was kidnapped and imprisoned in Iran for over a year. That was 2 years ago. I did not know Mr. Khashoggi. I think the Washington Post covered itself in glory and how hard they first battled to try to find him. And then, you know.
And so what does it mean when you've got, it seemed like the CIA, it seemed like we had tremendous evidence of what happened to this man, this journalist who had gone over there, and he was
murdered in the Saudi embassy.
Brutally, I won't go into details. And then the administration.
Well, President Trump has been very reluctant, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, to say that Saudi Arabia and its leader, in all probability, actually ordered and even carried out this horrible murder. But, you know, that's part of, you know, a bigger matrix where, you know, since Trump has taken office, he has set out to undermine not only what he calls the fake news media, but also the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement agencies, so that he, you know, is trying to create his own reality. And he does that obviously through Twitter and through his, you know, very successful manipulation of the mainstream news media too, which, you know, cover all of his tweets and all of the crazy things he says. But he is always the center of attention. That is how he governs.
Let's talk a little bit about how social media and the internet has really upended newspapers. It used to be, what was it? You know, if you read it in the newspaper, it must be true about Santa Claus back in the 30s and 40s. But we're a long way from that. We're a long way from Santa Claus. But what has social media, what has technology done to the disruption of the news?
Well, it's completely upended the business model for news and how news spreads. And it wasn't that long ago that, you know, even on the New York Times website, that, you know, the audience was directly coming to the Times and looking at the hierarchy of news and articles that Times editors had chosen and thought, you know, were deserving to be on the homepage and highlighted because they were important. Now everything has been disaggregated. Very few readers of the news are going to a particular site. 63% of American adults get most of their news on their Facebook news feeds. And that has been absolutely transformational. Most importantly, for how information spreads and how the audience becomes segmented. Because the way the almighty Facebook algorithm works is that, you know, it depends on you disclosing what you like. And, you know, Facebook knows exactly what articles you share. And so very quickly, all you're seeing is articles and information that you like. So you probably agree with it. And, you know, the people sharing the information with you are your close friends and family. Often they share your politics too. So everybody now, instead of having kind of a common meeting place for getting news and information, you know, everyone is in their own, they're called filter bubbles. And so the way Facebook works is, you know, you really don't see much that challenges your preconceived ideas.
And some of those, when you say Facebook news, it's not necessarily the Boston Globe News or the New York Times News. It's any kind of like page that somebody puts out there.
Right.
So whether or not what's on there is true or not, I see it on Island in some sites that we read it and we're like, this is absolutely not true, but it's presented that way.
Yeah, but even if something untrue or bizarre is circulating on Facebook, if someone you know has sent it to you, that actually has more credibility than the name the New York Times now, which is frightening.
Here I've got this section in Jill's book. If you would read this for a little bit, it's about 3 graphs. And she couldn't find her reading glasses, so let's see how it goes.
I think I can squint and do it. Starting at the yellow highlights. Right. What I'm writing about here is a party that I attended, which was in celebration of the 100th year of the Pulitzer Prizes. A big glitzy party in Washington, D.C. at a place called the Newseum, which, like lots of newspapers, is actually closing in a couple of weeks. So it too has seen its fortunes decline. But the people being celebrated were the lions of, journalism from the era where newspapers broke by far most of the important stories and were, how most people got their news. So I'm describing this kind of last moment of glitz for the old guard. The party celebrated journalism's golden age, but the celebrants were being through journalism's age of anxiety. All of them knew a colleague who had taken a buyout or been laid off. The newspaper industry had shed $1.3 billion worth of editors and reporters' jobs in the past decade, some 60% of its workforce since 2000. Some of the newspapers that won the prizes had gone out of business, more than 300 altogether, or were shadows of what they had been. There had been repeated assurances that more could be done with less. Even the newcomers, despite their bloated valuations, were hard-pressed to show profits. Global news gathering, meanwhile, remained monstrously expensive. The kind of investigative stories that won Pulitzers took months to report, took still more time to edit and make legally bulletproof, and were ever more costly. Editors had to safeguard accuracy and fairness. If a big story broke and they needed to scramble helicopters to flood the zone with reporters, they couldn't agonize over budgets. What was being threatened was very qualities that these prizes were meant to recognize. What was at risk was was bigger than just one industry. It was truth and freedom in a democracy, in a democratic society, an informed citizenry, and news sources that were above politics in their reporting.
Thanks, Jill. So when you entered you talk about getting a helicopter after a flood zone or whatever. I was stunned by the amount of money that was being spent in the New York Times at that time. When you entered into the Times and you get into management, what was the culture of the newsroom like? My experience is that it's been at a very small level. It's very much a men's profession in publishing, not a lot of women at the top.
Right.
So talk a little bit about what that culture was like and what was it like for a woman entering into it?
I mean, the culture was definitely male-dominated. I arrived at the Times. I came from the Wall Street Journal in 1997. And in order to get hired by the Times, you go to New York to, the famous old New York Times building, which has since been replaced, that was on 43rd Street. I had a list of the top editors who were on the masthead, and I had 20 minutes with each of them. And there was one woman and I think seven men that I saw. And, it wasn't like the Wall Street Journal had been, filled with senior women. It wasn't. But, the culture back then was if you got to the New York Times, which certainly everybody at the New York Times thinks is the best newspaper in the world, you were going to spend the rest of your career there. I mean, why on earth would you ever want to leave? And so people devoted their lives to working at the New York Times, and it was very much part of the identities of the reporters who worked there. Their names, in many ways, when you would hear them on the telephone, were less important than the "This is David Sanger of the New York Times." And, you know, what that completely changed in a world of social media and domination by Facebook, because if the news is no longer seen as a package, a coherent package created by one news organization, then basically the reporters themselves have to be the ones whose names are known, who people become loyal to, and the institutions themselves are sort of weakened. But it wasn't that long ago. Do all of you remember the Nate Silver, who had a great blog that at the point the New York Times, you know, sort of hosted it, had incredible accuracy in predicting elections. But after 2012, you know, he wanted to be bigger, he wanted more money, and his lawyer came to see me. And this was, you know, right after the 2012 election, so not that long ago. But, you know, the lawyer strode into my office and said to me, my client is the belle of the party. I represent the prettiest girl at the party. And I looked at him and, you know, in a very Jill Abramson, direct, stern tone of voice said, "Oh no, the New York Times is always the prettiest girl at the party." And, you know, now, I mean, I still do believe it's the prettiest girl at the party, but, you know, one can't be so certain.
I have to ask you a question. Do you have the New York Times logo or something tattooed somewhere? Somewhere I read that. Is that true?
I have I have 4 tattoos.
You have 4 more than I do.
It's pretentious to say this, but I think of them as like my personal hieroglyphics. Okay. You know, I'm not going to write a memoir about my life. So, you know, when I moved from Washington back to New York to become managing editor of the Times in 2003, I wanted to get a tattoo. And I wanted it to be, because I'm a born and bred New Yorker, I wanted something about New York. You know, not an apple, though. You know, who would want an apple tattoo? So, you know, I thought and got a New York City subway token.
Oh, wow.
As my first tattoo. And then 10 years after that, I just went wild. And I got 3 more, and one of them is the Times T, the Roman type.
I won't ask you where it is.
Huh? It's on my back.
Okay. Very cool, very cool. So when you...
People have asked me, because in 2014, the publisher of the Times chose to fire me from the job of executive editor. A lot of interviewers have asked me, did I get the T removed? Do I want to get the T removed? And I'm like, no, I still think, you know, I love the Times.
See, I thought you were very brave in your book, and when it happened, you said no. When they said, well, it's time for you to move on, or whatever they said, and I'm not leaving, you know, you're firing me. But not to say, oh, she's, you know, moving on for personal interest or any of that. And tell us a little bit about why you chose to go that route. The honesty route.
It's funny in life. Sometimes things you don't really take a very long time to think about. Decisions you make like that turn out to be important. And, you know, I knew that I was going to be fired. I had a lot of disputes with the business side of the Times. And So when the publisher called me up, I was prepared, and he handed me a folder that had a press release in it, all prepared, that the Times was going to release, saying that I was being replaced by Dean Baquet and that I had chosen to step down. And, you know, I looked, and the publisher then was Arthur Sulzberger Jr., and I said, Arthur, I have devoted my entire life and career to telling the truth, and I'm not going to stop now.
Good for you.
But the thing that was really interesting to me is, because I didn't really think that that was particularly brave, you know, it was what happened. But younger women, it really mattered to them that I said it and seemed not to be ashamed or see it as a terrible failure. I mean, I certainly wasn't happy to be fired from the job, but a lot of women came up to me afterwards and just said, thank you for what you did.
Right.
And they still do.
And you talk also about the disparity. You know, publishing is really a boys' club, but you talk about the disparity in pay and in perks. You know, we're always reading and hearing on the news that women, I don't know if we get 78 cents to the dollar or whatever, but there really is a discrepancy there. I had written something, very briefly, I'll say something about something I wrote in the paper about probably in here and there about this, you know, lack of parity in pay. And we got a letter to the editor from somebody who said, yes, because men deserve more. And I was pretty astounded. But that sort of seemed to be the attitude at the Times, didn't it?
Well, the newsroom remained, you know, the traditions were, you know, men set the salaries, men had the top jobs in the newsroom, and you know, I rose very quickly, and you know, foolishly just assumed, you know, of course, when I became Washington bureau chief and managing editor and then executive editor, I was going to be paid as much as the men in those jobs had. But an editor who worked for me asked whether we should do a gender study about pay in the newsroom. And I said, yeah. And, you know, of course we should. I thought I would be reassured by the findings. And when the report was finished, this editor walked into my office and said, here's our report, it's done, and you are Exhibit A.
And what did he mean by that?
It was a woman, actually.
Oh, okay. And what did
she
you
meant,
find out?
like, look at the history of your pay,
right.
And you know, it isn't what it should have been to be at parity. But the main problem, you know, but besides pay, and I always tell any audience I'm speaking to now, I mean, I was really foolish to when the job of executive editor was offered to me by Mr. Sulzberger in 2011. The one question I didn't ask him is, what's the pay? I just didn't. And you have to. It's a very sort of female reticent kind of thing not to
So your
ask.
reporter instincts did not kick in
No,
to be doubtful
you know.
and skeptical and check it out.
No, they failed me. They did.
Yeah.
But you know, one other problem at the Times, and this is true at all of the most prestigious news organizations, is that, you know, the top editing jobs in TV, the executive producers, the people who are actually choosing the most important news stories of the day, were by and large and overwhelmingly male. And you know, working at the Times, both in Washington and being managing editor for 8 years, there was no doubt in my mind that there were so many qualified women who were ready to have these top jobs that, you know, when I became executive editor, you know, after year one, the masthead, which is the names of the most senior editors that get printed in the paper every day, it was easy to get to half. It had never been 50% before. It isn't 50% now. But those are the kinds of cultural issues that persist. It's better at some of these all-digital news organizations that I also write about in the book. Their staffs and their teams of editors are younger, and they just are more diverse in general. The reason that I picked two all-digital institutions to focus on and two very important legacy news institutions is I was actually copying the framework of a book that was an important reason why I got into journalism at all, which also has a tie to Nantucket, because it was a book that David Halberstam wrote in 1979 called The Powers That Be. And in that book, it was published 5 years after President Nixon's resignation. And the press at that point was really at the height of both its profit-making and its power. And the way Halberstam told this story is he made it a great, juicy narrative, and he told it through 4 places. His places were CBS, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and I'm blanking on the Washington Post.
Okay.
And Time. And, it was just delightful to read. And I wanted to make this a whale of a story, not some dutiful tome about the importance of the press or something whining about the death of newspapers. I wanted to explain what had happened and what I had witnessed over the last decade and tell it through characters and stories.
So it's broken down into 3 sections. It starts with BuzzFeed. It's like 1, 2, 3. BuzzFeed and Vice and the Post. I think Post first, and then the Times.
Yeah.
And then 1, and then the same thing 2, and then 3. It's also got Facebook in there. But in the back, there are 30 pages of notes, and then the bibliography after that.
Yeah, it's actually 70 pages.
Well, it's extremely well researched.
But it was important to me that it really, as Halberstam, I think, does so brilliantly. He was a New York Times journalist. He was stationed in Vietnam, long-time Nantucket resident, and, great book writer. And, I was taking on something big by modeling this on his book. But, we are moving into, a world where everything is going to be digital. We're almost there. Can I ask for hands? How many of you still read? I know you read Marianne's paper in print, but how many of you still read like the Times or the Boston Globe in print? Yeah, it's unusual because I'm telling you, I teach 2 journalism classes at Harvard, and for the past 4 years, I asked that first class who reads a print newspaper. They never touch print. They're never going to touch print. And, the print New York Times has, in a way, it gets, more expensive. To get home delivery of the Times 7 days a week now costs something like $1,300 a year. It's, an expensive thing. And, so it almost is, the print paper is almost like a specialized product. And for most of my career, the print paper was responsible for most of the profits and revenue of the Times.
But now that their model has changed, and aren't they getting more money
from digital?
Yeah, almost. And so circulation is growing. I mean, Donald Trump is
advertising is tanking. Yeah. And, the thing that is scary for most news organizations right now, fighting to stay in business, is that not many of them have a product that people are willing to pay for on the internet. I mean, the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, they are, so good and have such original news reports that no one else is providing. And so their audiences will pay. But by and large, the ethos is still the web. News wants to be free on the web.
So what's interesting in your book is Chapter 3 in the Washington Post, and that's with Jeff Bezos, with his acquisition, and putting his resources into play to make that robust digitally, right. Because that looked like a newspaper that was about to
It was
end.
Really, when I was still in Washington as bureau chief of the Times, it had declined. It went through 7 series of layoffs and buyouts. I mean, this was the paper of Ben Bradley and Woodward and Bernstein, and poor Don Graham could just not keep it afloat. He had to keep slashing the staff. I mean, some of it was his own fault. Some of these wounds are self-inflicted by the newspapers, but it had become noticeably less competitive with the Times on stories about the government, the Congress, the courts, et cetera. And it didn't take much besides money to bring it back. When Don Graham first called Jeff Bezos to see if he'd be interested in buying the Washington Post, he said, "Why would I buy a newspaper? I don't know anything about the newspaper business." And then he started thinking, could he help it? Could he help it stay alive? And he decided he could, and he promised Don Graham and Bob Woodward, who dealt with him in the pre-sale period, that he would provide the runway, the money to be a runway so that the Washington Post could take off again. And certainly by the 2016 election, they were back in full form.
Right. But,
the model of having billionaires zoom in to rescue you isn't universally applicable. I mean, it's happened, I'm glad it happened in LA, and so far that paper seems to be improving. Rupert Murdoch bought the Journal.
And I think it's a better newspaper since he bought it.
Yeah, he hasn't, hasn't really. I mean, it was always a conservative editorial
but
page,
it's gotten more lifestyle, and I don't look at the editorial opinion page because it'll make me crazy. But the lifestyle, I think I have to say, I think the Wall Street Journal Weekend is more entertaining to read than the New York Times, Sunday Times, which although I still buy them both, but we've seen where investment has been made into newspapers. They have come back. There's an example of out in Western Mass.
What has been the best thing for newspapers? The gift has been Donald Trump. I'm serious. CNN, which was struggling before 2016, has made billions on, all Trump all the time. He does get an audience. And, people were angry during the primaries when CNN would show an empty podium waiting for one of the Trump rallies to start. But people loved watching him, and they still apparently do. And the Times, has almost 3 million new digital subscribers. They call it the Trump bump.
The Trump bump. I have one question for you, Jill, and then we're going to open it up to the audience because I'm getting the high sign. Oh, we're almost out of time, but I have to ask this question. So why are newspapers, whether they're in print or digital, why are they important? Why should the community care if they have one?
They're vitally important, number one, because they still break the most significant stories. Number two, and I said this at the Unitarian Church, the founders of our country were deathly afraid of authoritarian power. They had rebelled from the king. And they saw the press, newspapers, as the bulwark, the protectors of the people against, against abuse of power, basically. And without newspapers and, investigations into local corruptions, zoning boards, whatever, how are the people going to know? They're not going to know. And so that's why they're so important.
Okay.
We're not going to do a lightning round of questions.
Well, yeah, so Mary says we have one question. A couple of questions. Make them a real question and really good. Well, here we have, I pointed to her, so you, okay, there we go.
So do you think that local news is in crisis, inking or notwithstanding, and what do you think is the cure for that? Do you think there's a path out of that?
That is the one, I mean, it's a great question, which was, it's called the news desert. Now 1,000 local and community and regional papers have closed. There are many state capitals now that go uncovered, many city governments that maybe have one reporter where they used to have 6. And, the reason for that is that they subsisted on classified advertising, and Craigslist wiped that out, and they've been in decline ever since. And, I wish that I had, a solution for that crisis. Nonprofits is a partial solution. Asking readers to pay for local sports, things they really want, but it's tough and quite frightening because it's the news that's closest to the people and most trusted too, at a time when trust in the news media is going this way.
Yes.
And so here with the fragmentation of the news media in general, how do we solve the conundrum of identifying reliable news sources that are out there, because everybody's turning their outlet of choice, like you said. I mean, how do reliable news organizations that are trustworthy and have been around a long time remain relevant?
Well, they remain relevant for precisely they are trustworthy and important. And there is an organization that gives the equivalent of the Good Housekeeping seal of approval to various it's called NewsGuard. It's pretty good.
All right.
Oh, come on.
All right, one more really good one. You look really excited.
Can you speak to the veracity, the truth, the fact-finding value of the, I'll call them upstart new media, the online media like BuzzFeed and
Yeah, well, BuzzFeed got a black eye during the Mueller investigation. They had a story, they published a story saying Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress, which is apparently not true. And, they're suffering for it. And, I don't think the same level of training and that the same standards of journalism apply to enough of these new upstarts.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jill. This has been great.